The revival of learning denotes in its broadest sense the gradual enlightenment of the human mind after the darkness of the Middle Ages. The names Renaissance and humanism are often applied to the same movement. The term Renaissance, which was first used in England only as late as the 19th century, etymologically means rebirth. Broadly speaking, the Renaissance implies the reawakening of learning which came to Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. The Renaissance was not only English but a European phenomenon, and basically considered it signaled a thorough substitution of the medieval habits of thought by new attitudes. During the period of Renaissance, the English language changed very swiftly in keeping with rapid social, economic, and political changes. However, writers in particular soon came to realize that the vocabulary of English language did not always allow them to talk and write accurately about new concepts, techniques, and inventions which were emerging in Europe. At the same time, a period of increasing exploration and trade across the whole world introduced new words, many of which had their origin in other languages. Historians of the language have suggested that between 1500 and 1650, around 12,000 new words were introduced into English. As noted in the related language note, words came into English from over 50 different languages. By far, the majority were derived from Latin. Many of the Latin and Greek words provided a more formal alternative to existing native English words. In many cases, however, no suitable English words existed. The arguments are complicated further. However, by desire to replace Latin with English as the national language, yet at the same time to continue to recognize Latin as a repository of cultural values and literary models. Such paradoxes and tensions continue to influence language choices, particularly choices in vocabulary in English, and have affected debates about the nature of literature and of literary language since the 16th century. The resulting lexicon of English is certainly one which is rich in synonyms and alternative phrasings, allowing switches in formality between the more written and elevated character of classical vocabulary and the more spoken, everyday and natural English which has grown from more distinctly Anglo Saxon roots. Other language notes which deal with standards of language, Wordsworth's Real Language of Men, and the Fragmenting Lexicon also deal with issues raised by the inkhorn controversy and by the fundamental lexical divisions brought about by the history of language change and variation in English. The dawn of Renaissance came first to Italy and a little later to France. To England, it came much later, roughly about the beginning of the 16th century. In Italy, the impact of Greek learning was felt after the Turkish conquest of Constantinople. The Greek scholars fled and took refuge in Italy, carrying with them a vast treasure of ancient Greek literature in manuscript. The study of this literature fired the soul and imagination of Italy at that time and created a new kind of intellectual and aesthetic culture quite different from the Middle Ages. Firstly, the Renaissance meant the death of medieval scholasticism, which had for long been keeping human thoughts in bondage. The schoolmen got themselves entangled in useless controversies and tried to apply the principles of Aristotelian philosophy to the doctrines of Christianity, thus giving birth to a vast literature. Secondly, it signaled a revolt against the spiritual authority, the authority of Pope. The Reformation, though not a part of the revival of learning, was yet a companion movement in England. This defiance of spiritual authority went hand in hand with that of intellectual authority. Thirdly, the Renaissance implied a greater perception of beauty and polish in the Greek and Latin scholars. This beauty and this polish was sought by Renaissance men of letters to be incorporated into their native literature. Further, it meant the birth of a kind of imitative tendency implied in term classicism. Lastly, the Renaissance marked a change from theocentric to the homocentric conception of the universe. Human values came to be recognized as permanent values, and they were sought to be enriched and illuminated by the heritage of antiquity. This brought a new kind of paganism and marked the rise of humanism and also by implication materialism. The most important prose writers who exhibit well the influence of the Renaissance on English prose are Erasmus, Sir Thomas More, Lilly, and Sidney. Erasmus was a Dutchman who came to Oxford to learn Greek. His chief work was The Praise of Folly, which is the English translation of his most important work written in England. So Thomas More's Utopia was the true prologue to the Renaissance. It was the first book written by an Englishman which achieved European fame. But it was written in Latin and only later was translated into English. More's Utopia is an imaginary island which is the habitat of an ideal republic. By the picture of the ideal state is implied a kind of social criticism of contemporary Ireland. More's indebtedness to Plato's Republic is quite obvious. However, More seems also to be indebted to the then recent discoveries of the explorers and navigators like Vasco da Gama, who were mostly of Spanish and Portuguese nationalities. In Utopia, More discredits medievalism in all its implications and exalts the ancient Greek culture. Passing on to the prose writers of the Elizabethan age, the age of the flowering of the Renaissance, we find them markedly influenced both in their style and thought content by the revival of antique classical learning. Sidney in Arcadia, Lilly in Euphues, and Hooker in the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity write the English which is away from the language of common speech and is either too heavily laden, as in case of Lilly and Sidney, with bits of classical finery, or modelled on Latin syntax. Further, in his own career and his essays, Bacon stands as a representative of the materialistic, Machiavellian facet of the Renaissance, particularly of Renaissance Italy. He combines in himself the dispassionate pursuit of truth and the keen desire for material advance. Sir Thomas Watt and Earl of Surrey were pioneers of the new poetry in England. After Chaucer, the spirit of English poetry had slumbered for upward of a century. The change in pronunciation in the 15th century had created a lot of confusion in prosody, which in the practice of such important poets as Lydgate and Skeleton had been reduced to a mockery. Watt had travelled extensively in Italy and France and had come under the spell of the Italian Renaissance. It must be remembered that the work of Watt and Surrey does not reflect the impact of the Rome of antiquity alone, but also that of modern Italy. So far as the versification is concerned, Watt and Surrey imported into English various new Italian metrical patterns. Moreover, they gave poetry a new sense of grace, dignity, delicacy, and harmony, which was found by them lacking in the works of Chaucer and the Chaucerians alike. Further, they were highly influenced by the love poetry of Petrarch, and they did their best to imitate it. Petrarch's love poetry is of the country kind, in which the pining lover is shown as a servant of his mistress, with his heart tempest tossed by her neglect and his mood varying according to her absence or presence. It goes to the credit of Watt to have introduced the sonnet into English literary, and of Surrey to have first written blank verse. Both the sonnet and the blank verse were later to be practiced by a vast number of the best English poets. Watt wrote in all 32 sonnets, out of which 17 are adaptations of Petrarch. Most of them have the rhyme scheme of Petrarch's sonnets. Surrey's work is characterized by exquisite grace and tenderness, which we find missing from that of Watt. Moreover, he is a better craftsman and gives greater harmony to his poetry. Surrey employed blank verse in his translation of the fourth book of the Aeneid, and the work which was first translated into English verse by Gavin Douglas a generation earlier, but in heroic couplets. The revival of ancient classical learning scored its first clear impact on England drama in the middle of the 16th century. Previous to this impact, there had been a pretty vigorous native tradition of drama, particularly comedy. This tradition had its origin in the liturgical drama and had progressed through the miracle and mystery, and later the morality to the interlude. John Haywood had written quite a few vigorous interludes, but they were altogether different in tone, spirit, and purpose from the Greek and Roman drama of antiquity. The first English regular tragedy, Gorboduc, and comedy, Ralph Roister Doister, were very much imitations of classical tragedy and comedy. Gorboduc is a slavish imitation of Senecan tragedy and has all its features without much of its life. Like Senecan tragedy, it has revenge as the tragic motive, has most of its important incidents narrated on the stage by messengers, has much of rhetoric and wordy declamation, has a ghost among its dramatis persona, and so forth. It is indeed a good instance of the blood and thunder kind of tragedy. Later on, the universities struck a note of independence in their dramatic work. They refused to copy Roman drama as slavishly as the writers of Gorboduc and Roister Doister. Even so, their plays are not free from the impact of Renaissance. Rather, they show it as amply, though not in the same way. In their imagination, they were all fired by the new literature, which showed them new dimensions of human capability. In this respect, Marlowe stands in the forefront of the university wits. Rightly has he been called the true child of the Renaissance.